The grasslands lay silent under a darkening sky streaked with dying light. A weary wind whispered through the brittle prairie grass, sweeping past the weathered frame of a solitary cabin standing against the horizon. Within those walls, a lone cowboy crouched by the fireplace, running his blade across a whetstone as evening settled in. Firelight danced in his grizzled beard, and his pale eyes, vacant and far away, held the kind of isolation that loses its voice. Years had passed this way for him, marking time by the groaning of old wood and the distant howling of wild dogs. His world remained unchanging. Then came that particular evening. A noise drifted from the direction of the barn, gentle, hesitant. He stopped, straining to hear. This wasn't the groan of timber or the stirring of livestock. This was distinctly human, fragile, afraid. Rising to his feet, his worn boots barely making a sound on the planks, he grabbed his oil lamp. The wick guttered as he pushed through the door into the bitter cold, his exhalations forming clouds. The sharp wind stung his skin, pushing him back toward shelter. Yet something about that faint cry drew him onward into the blackness. Crossing into the barn, he let the lamplight wash over the hay-scattered ground. Initially, he detected only darkness and floating dust particles. Then, against the distant wall, he noticed shifting, one shape drawing another nearer, attempting concealment. He raised the lamp. Two sets of eyes caught the wavering glow, one belonging to an elder, the other to someone younger. The older woman's face bore the marks of desert survival. Her hair fell in silver strands from beneath a ragged covering. Her dark gaze locked onto his, not with terror but with bone-deep weariness. Next to her, a woman not yet 20 stared through matted hair, her features gaunt, her mouth parched and split. The cowboy's grip tightened on the lamp's base. Experience had taught him wariness. In this isolated place, unexpected visitors often spelled danger. Yet when the younger one coughed, a brittle, empty rasp, something inside him gave way. Speaking no explanation, he set the lamp down and murmured, "Looks like you're both freezing." Silence answered him, the elder's fingers wrapped around her daughter's arm, poised to run despite having no destination. He turned his back, returned to the house, and came bearing provisions. A wedge of cornbread, canned beans, what remained of his coffee grounds. He placed them within reach and withdrew, allowing them the choice. A lengthy pause followed, filled only by the lamp's trembling flame. Finally, the younger woman extended her hand toward the bread, pausing, seeking his approval. At his nod, she ate, slowly, shaking. The old woman joined her, silent tears coursing down her weathered cheeks as she spoke soft words in her own language. Phrases he couldn't translate, but whose meaning, thankfulness, resonated clearly. He brought them coverings before nightfall and retreated to his dwelling. Rest eluded him. The vision of their faces, starved yet dignified, haunted his thoughts. He understood deprivation, but not the kind that came with being prey. He could almost sense the weight of their suffering carried on the night breeze, woven into the cries of distant predators. Morning brought the aroma of smoke and fresh baking. He'd prepared a pot of broth on his stove and transported it wordlessly. They remained. The daughter cradled her mother's head, humming a melody that swelled and ebbed like wind through tall reeds. Upon his entrance, the song ceased, both turning toward him. He set the broth before them and departed again. No interrogation, no expectations, merely quietness and the delicate balance of staying near enough to assist, distant enough to avoid frightening them. Time moved forward in this unspoken pattern. The elder began tidying the entrance when her strength allowed. The daughter carried water from the creek, her steps deliberate but gaining confidence. Occasionally, while repairing boundaries or patching the roof, he'd notice her observing him, her expression inquisitive, nearly tranquil. Conversation was rare, yet something intangible flowed between them, a tentative connection forged from mutual isolation. One twilight, as the sun dissolved beyond the ridges, the old woman positioned herself beside his hearth, wrapped in a blanket he'd offered. Her tone was barely audible when she finally broke the silence. "There's no one else for you here." He shook his head. "They're all gone." She acknowledged this as though it clarified everything. Then glancing toward her daughter asleep near the flames, she added, "We've lost everyone too." Her words wavered, though her gaze remained resolute. The world overlooks those without roots. He couldn't formulate a response, so he refilled her cup. Beyond the walls, thunder rolled across the flatlands. Within, 3 displaced souls found comfort without exchanging names. Later, the tempest tore open the heavens. Rain hammered the rooftop, relentless and fierce. The old woman began speaking once more, this time addressing not him but the storm itself, the recollections it carried. She recounted tales of armed forces and razed settlements, of her people's forced exodus from ancestral grounds, of countless nights concealed beneath fallen timber while her infant slept against her. The cowboy remained by the hearth, motionless, the blade he'd been honing now forgotten in his grasp. Every syllable she uttered felt like pressure building in his chest. When silence returned, he offered just one sentence. "Stay here however long you must." She studied him extensively, and within her look existed something timeless and appreciative, a parent's faith. The wind beyond began subsiding. Firelight played across her creased features like sunrise touching ancient rock. Before sleep overtook her, she breathed something so delicate he nearly missed it. "Your spirit is generous, cowboy. My child will find safety here." He remained there well after her voice dissolved into the rainfall. "Safety," she'd said. The term reverberated through the dwelling, gentle yet substantial, occupying the space between solitude and something he hadn't experienced in years. Connection. The cold season withdrew gradually, as if hesitant to relinquish its grip on the desolate terrain. Each sunrise arrived slightly gentler, each gust slightly milder, bringing fragrances of vegetation and moisture rather than ice. The dwelling, once a soundless refuge for a solitary man, had started breathing like an actual home. Wisps rose softly from its chimney, and laughter, small, uncertain yet genuine, occasionally emerged from inside. The cowboy sensed it before acknowledging it. The emptiness of his existence had transformed. The 2 Apache women had converted the stillness into something vital. The elder's vitality returned gradually. She no longer drifted like a specter, though her breathing frequently faltered. The daughter nursed her mother with almost sacred patience. He observed her sometimes through the window, how she combed her mother's hair, how she draped the shawl around her before sunrise, how she sang in a tongue the breezes seemed to comprehend. Words became unnecessary between them. The cadence of her melodies and the consistent sound of his footsteps on the planks communicated sufficiently. He started sharing simple knowledge: how to tend the animals, how to predict weather by cloud formations, how to repair barriers with wire and determination. She absorbed quickly, chuckling when the tool slipped or the cord scraped her palms. That laughter, its very sound, settled into his core, unsettling yet tender simultaneously. Certain evenings, when the illumination turned golden and thick, they'd rest by the entrance in wordlessness, the landscape extending infinitely ahead. She'd sketch patterns in the earth with a twig, and he'd find himself wishing she'd never cease. One dusk, as twilight spread like spilled wine across the meadows, the old woman summoned him. She rested near the flames, her covering slipping from her frail frame. Her gaze, though fatigued, held something beyond vitality, something resembling serenity. She requested he sit. He complied, uneasy, detecting the gravity of what her silence contained. "You've shown us compassion," she spoke, her voice like aged hide, fractured yet sturdy. "You provided without demanding. You nourished us when we were merely phantoms." Her attention drifted toward her daughter, who stood outside collecting water. "I'm elderly. I've traveled farther than most souls could endure. My remaining time is brief." He wanted to object, but her upraised hand quieted him. "She'll soon face the world alone," the old woman continued gently. "She has no siblings, no community, no patriarch for protection. The world shows no mercy. You understand this?" The firelight quivered against his features. He remained silent. "She is my essence, cowboy. And you?" She hesitated, her breathing irregular. "You possess a worthy one. When I depart, swear to me you won't allow her to disappear into starvation and wilderness. Swear you'll take her as your bride, not from sympathy but because affection already dwells here. You simply haven't recognized it." Her declaration pierced him more profoundly than any weapon. Affection. The concept terrified him more than combat ever had. He bowed his head, hands clasped, attempting to steady the turmoil within. Before he could respond, the young woman entered bearing a water pail. She saw her mother's expression, ashen and remote, and rushed to her side. The old woman smiled weakly, caressed her daughter's face, and whispered something in her native speech, something that resembled goodbye. That evening, The wind intensified again. He sat wakeful by the flames, watching the old woman rest, her respiration shallow and irregular. The young woman stayed beside her until dawn's first rays penetrated the coverings. When she realized her mother's chest had stilled, she released no sound. Only a profound, crushing stillness descended upon her, as though she'd petrified. He ventured outside to excavate the resting place beneath the cottonwood. Each thrust of the spade pierced frozen earth, pierced memory, pierced something within him he couldn't identify. When completed, they lowered her gently. The young woman positioned a carved wooden ornament in her mother's palm, a fragment of her ancestry, of a vanished existence. She whispered a song that floated through the limbs like vapor, and he felt undeserved tears sting his vision. Afterward, neither uttered a word. They remained standing together until sunset stretched lengthy shadows across the ground. In the following days, quietness governed the dwelling again. Yet this wasn't the empty quietness of earlier times. This was the hush of two individuals learning to survive through sorrow. He attempted working the land, mending barriers, feeding livestock, but his gaze perpetually sought her, how she continued lighting the morning fire, how she looked toward the cottonwood as if expecting her mother's essence to respond. Her resilience humbled him. It wasn't dramatic or aggressive, but unshakable. Weeks elapsed before language returned. One evening, he discovered her seated on the entrance platform, the day's final light caught in her hair. He positioned himself behind her, hat gripped tightly, heart thundering like galloping hooves. "Your mother requested I watch over you," he said, his voice unsteady. "But that's not my reason for being here now." She rotated slowly, her gaze probing his. "I want to remain," he said. "Not from obligation, but because I discovered something here I never imagined I'd possess again, a purpose for existing." For an extended moment she said nothing. Then she stood, her hand slightly trembling as she made contact with his arm. There was no ritual, no verbal commitment, only the reality inscribed in their wordlessness. The wind altered course, warm and fragrant, carrying scents of grass and soil. He reached into his pocket and extracted a small silver band he'd crafted himself, imperfect but sincere. When he positioned it in her palm, she enclosed her fingers around it as though it were radiance itself, the prairie surrounding them illuminated in the fading sun. Somewhere distant, a coyote called out, a solitary sound dissolving into tranquility. In that instant, standing beneath the limitless heavens, the cowboy understood that existence had restored what it once stole, not merely companionship, but a home, a pulse, a tomorrow. And as he gazed into her eyes, the descending sun behind her, he comprehended that certain vows aren't vocalized. They're simply embodied.